What if the worst moment of your life became the doorway to discovering who you really are? Gerald Thornton didn't believe in second chances. At 68, he'd built an empire on the back of hard decisions and harder words, never once looking over his shoulder at the people he'd stepped on to get there. His suits cost more than most people's monthly rent. His watch could feed a family for months. And on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon in March, when he walked into Rosie's Diner on 5th Street, he had no idea that a coffee stain and a quiet woman's eyes would crack open the armor he'd been building for 40 years. Sometimes grace arrives wearing an apron and orthopedic shoes. Sometimes it speaks in a voice so soft you almost miss it. Sometimes it takes watching someone choose kindness when they have every right to choose anger. Where are you watching from today? Gerald Thornton's mornings always started the same way. Black coffee at 5:30, phone calls by 6, and his driver pulling up at 7 sharp. He'd made his fortune in real estate, turning struggling neighborhoods into profitable developments, though he rarely thought about the families who'd been displaced along the way. That was business. That was survival. His daughter Emma used to argue with him about it before she stopped calling altogether. But Gerald told himself he didn't need anyone's approval. He had 3 homes, a company worth millions, and the respect that money commands, even if it isn't freely given. The morning hadn't gone well. His lawyer called about another lawsuit, some former tenants claiming negligence. Paperwork problems. Nothing he couldn't bury under enough legal fees. But it put him in a foul mood, the kind that made his jaw tight and his words sharp. When his usual cafe was closed for renovations, he told his driver to find somewhere else, anywhere. He didn't care. They ended up at Rosie's Diner, a place Gerald would normally drive past without noticing. Red vinyl booths worn smooth by decades of use. A jukebox in the corner that probably still played vinyl. The smell of bacon grease and coffee that had been brewing since dawn. He walked in like he owned the place, though his expensive shoes felt out of place on the checkered linoleum. The lunch crowd hadn't arrived yet. Just a few regulars at the counter, working men in paint-splattered clothes, a woman reading the newspaper over eggs and toast. Gerald chose a booth near the window, already irritated by the plastic menus and paper napkins. His phone buzzed. Another problem. Always another problem. She appeared so quietly he didn't notice her at first. A woman in her early 60s, gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a pink uniform that had seen better days. Her name tag said Dorothy in faded letters. She smiled at him, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, the kind that's given freely without expecting anything back. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm. "Coffee to start?" Gerald barely looked up from his phone. "Black, and I don't have time to wait." "I'll be right back with that," Dorothy said, and there wasn't a trace of offense in her voice. Just that same gentle kindness. She returned quickly, pot in hand, and began to pour. Her hands were steady despite the arthritis he could see swelling her knuckles. She'd probably been doing this work for 30 years, maybe more. The kind of woman who showed up even when her feet hurt, even when life knocked her down. That's when Gerald's phone rang. He jerked his arm up to check the caller, and his elbow hit the coffee pot just as Dorothy was pulling it away. Hot coffee splashed across his sleeve, darkening the fabric of his $2,000 suit jacket. He shot to his feet like he'd been burned, though the coffee had barely touched his skin. But it was the principle, the inconvenience, the audacity of this clumsy woman ruining his morning. "What the hell is wrong with you?" The words came out louder than he intended, sharp enough that the people at the counter turned to look. Dorothy stepped back, the coffee pot still in her hand, her expression shifting from surprise to something else. Not fear exactly. More like sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from seeing something you'd hoped wasn't true turn out to be exactly what you feared. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said quietly, setting down the pot and reaching for napkins. "Let me help clean that up." But Gerald was already in full fury, the morning's frustrations finding a target. "You're sorry? Do you have any idea what this suit costs? Do you have any idea who I am?" His voice carried across the diner, each word designed to cut. "I could buy this pathetic place 10 times over. I should sue you for damages. I should have you fired. What kind of incompetent ... He stopped because Dorothy was looking at him. Really looking at him. Not with anger or fear or even embarrassment. Her eyes were blue, he noticed. The kind of blue that made you think of summer skies and clear water. And in them he saw something that made him falter mid-sentence. Not judgment. Something worse. Pity. She pitied him. This woman in her worn-out uniform, serving coffee for tips, was looking at him like he was the one who needed help. Like he was the one who'd lost something precious and didn't even know it was gone. "Sir," Dorothy said, and her voice was still gentle, still steady. "It was an accident. I take full responsibility. I'll pay for the dry cleaning myself." She was already pulling a towel from her apron, dabbing at his sleeve with careful, practiced movements. Gerald wanted to pull away, wanted to storm out, but something kept him rooted there. Maybe it was the way the other diners were staring at him now. Not at her. At him. Their expressions weren't sympathetic. They were disappointed. Disgusted even. One of the men at the counter, an older fellow with white hair and hands scarred from manual labor, shook his head slowly. "She's been working here for 23 years, he said to no one in particular. "Never once seen Dorothy spill a drop on purpose. That's more than I can say for most people's character." Gerald's face flushed. "I don't care how long she's worked here. She ruined my jacket." "Your jacket will be fine," the man replied, turning back to his coffee. "Question is whether your soul can say the same." The words stung more than they should have. Gerald was about to fire back when Dorothy spoke again. "It's okay, Henry," she said to the man at the counter. "The gentleman's upset. We all have bad days." She turned back to Gerald, and that's when he noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From something else. Fatigue, maybe. Or pain. "I truly am sorry, sir. If you'd like, I can give you the owner's information. We'll make this right." "Forget it," Gerald muttered, suddenly wanting to be anywhere but there, under the weight of all those eyes. He threw a 20 on the table, far more than the coffee would have cost, and headed for the door. But just before he reached it, Dorothy's voice stopped him. "Sir? You forgot your phone." He turned. She was holding it out to him, her expression still kind despite everything he'd said. Despite the way he'd treated her like she was beneath him. He walked back and snatched it from her hand without a word, and this time he didn't miss the wince that crossed her face as she lowered her arm. Something was wrong with her shoulder. He could see it in the careful way she moved. Outside, his driver was waiting. Gerald climbed into the back seat and told him to drive. Just drive. But as they pulled away from the diner, he couldn't stop seeing Dorothy's face. That sad, pitying look. Like she knew something about him that he didn't want to admit. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, but Gerald couldn't focus. He kept thinking about the diner. About the way that old man at the counter had looked at him. About Dorothy's quiet dignity. About the fact that she'd offered to pay for his dry cleaning when she probably made minimum wage plus tips. That evening, alone in his penthouse apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, he found himself Googling Rosie's diner. He didn't know why. Just curiosity, he told himself. The diner's website was simple, almost amateur. But there was a section with photos of the staff. And there she was, Dorothy Brennan. Age 63. 23 years with Rosie's Diner. The brief bio mentioned she was a grandmother of 4. A widow, and the heart of our morning crew. There was a photo of her smiling with other servers. And in that picture she looked different, happier, lighter, before he'd torn into her. Gerald closed his laptop and poured himself a scotch. His reflection in the window stared back at him. When had he become this person? When had he started measuring his worth by the cost of his suit instead of the content of his character? His father had been a mailman. His mother had cleaned houses to put him through college. They'd taught him to respect people who worked hard, regardless of their station. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten. Or maybe he'd chosen to forget. It was easier to look down on people than to see yourself in them. If this moment touched your heart, if you've ever seen someone choose grace over anger, please give the video a thumbs up. Let's keep this story reaching those who need to hear it. That night, Gerald couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Dorothy's hands. The arthritis. The way she'd winced. The fact that she'd still been kind to him. He thought about his own daughter, Emma, who'd stopped calling after he'd belittled her fiancé at Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. The young man wasn't rich enough, wasn't impressive enough. Gerald had made his opinions clear. Emma had made her choice clear too. She chose love over money. She chose her father-in-law, a high school teacher who treated her with respect, over her own father who'd spent her whole life trying to mold her into someone she wasn't at 2 in the morning. Gerald made a decision. He didn't know if it was the right one. Didn't know if it would change anything. But he couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try. He would go back to that diner. He would apologize. Really apologize. The way his mother had taught him to do when he was 6 years old and had broken Mr. Henderson's window with a baseball. Look someone in the eye. Take responsibility. Make it right. But when Gerald arrived at Rosie's diner at 7 the next morning, ready with an apology he'd rehearsed a dozen times, Dorothy wasn't there. A different waitress greeted him. Younger, with tired eyes and a professional smile. Table for one? Actually, I'm looking for Dorothy. Dorothy Brennan. Is she working today? The waitress's smile faded. You a friend of hers? Not exactly. I was here yesterday. I need to speak with her. The waitress studied him for a moment, and Gerald had the uncomfortable feeling she knew exactly who he was. Maybe Dorothy had mentioned the incident. Maybe the whole staff knew about the angry man in the expensive suit who'd berated their colleague over spilled coffee. Dorothy's not here, the waitress finally said. She's in the hospital. The words hit Gerald like a physical blow. What? What happened? She collapsed yesterday afternoon during her shift. Turned out she'd been working through pain for weeks. Rotator cuff tear, they said. Needed surgery. Should have had it months ago, but she couldn't afford to take time off. Single grandmother raising 2 of her grandkids since their parents passed. Can't lose the paycheck, you know? Can't lose the health insurance. The waitress's tone wasn't accusatory exactly, but it wasn't warm either. She came back in after lunch yesterday. Finished her shift even after what happened with. She paused. After what happened in the morning. Gerald felt sick. Dorothy had continued working. After he'd humiliated her. After her shoulder was clearly causing her pain. Because she couldn't afford not to. Which hospital? The waitress hesitated. Why do you want to know? Please. It was perhaps the first time in years Gerald had said that word and actually meant it. I need to see her. I need to apologize. Something in his face must have convinced her because she pulled out a notepad and wrote down an address. St. Mary's Medical Center. Room 412. Visiting hours start at 10, she said, handing him the paper. And sir? Dorothy's the kindest person I know. If you're going there to cause more trouble... I'm not, Gerald said quietly. I promise. I just need to make something right. He spent the next 2 hours in his car, parked outside the hospital, trying to figure out what to say. Sorry seemed inadequate. How do you apologize for being cruel? How do you explain that you'd lost yourself so completely that you'd forgotten how to see people as human? At 10 o'clock sharp, he walked through the hospital doors, bought flowers from the gift shop, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Room 412 was at the end of the hall. Through the partially open door, he could hear children's voices, laughing. Gerald almost turned around. This was a mistake. He had no right to intrude on her recovery, her family time. But then he heard Dorothy's voice, warm and patient, reading what sounded like a storybook. The same voice that had said good morning to him yesterday. The same voice that had called him sir even after he'd treated her like dirt. He knocked softly. The reading stopped. Come in, Dorothy called. Gerald pushed open the door. Dorothy was propped up in bed, her left arm in a sling, her hair loose around her shoulders. 2 children sat on either side of her, a boy about 8 and a girl maybe 6, both with Dorothy's blue eyes. They looked at Gerald with curiosity. Dorothy looked at him with surprise and something else. Recognition. Not anger. Just that same quiet awareness, Mr. She began, then stopped. I don't think I ever got your name. Gerald, he said, his voice rough. Gerald Thornton. I came to apologize. The children were staring at him now. He felt like he was shrinking under their innocent gaze. For yesterday. For the way I spoke to you. There's no excuse for it. I was cruel and thoughtless, and you deserved so much better. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to own up to your worst behavior? When you had to look someone you'd wronged in the eye and take responsibility? If this moment resonates with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter. Dorothy's expression softened. Mr. Thornton, you didn't need to come all the way here. Yes, I did. Gerald stepped closer, setting the flowers on the side table. I found out you got hurt, that you kept working even though you were in pain. And I realized that while I was yelling at you about a coffee stain, you were dealing with something real, something that mattered, and you were still kind to me. His voice cracked slightly. Why? Why were you kind to me when I was so terrible to you? Dorothy was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on her granddaughter's hair. When she spoke, her words were simple, but they cut straight through to Gerald's heart. Because someone was kind to me once when I needed it most, she said. And I decided a long time ago that I'd pass that kindness forward, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Gerald pulled up a chair and Dorothy didn't object. The children, curious but polite, watched this strange man with the expensive clothes settle awkwardly beside their grandmother's hospital bed. Tell me, Gerald said quietly. Tell me about that kindness. If you don't mind. Dorothy glanced at her grandchildren. Michael, sweetheart, can you and Lily go get some juice from the nurse's station? I saw they had those little boxes you like. The children scrambled off the bed, and once they were gone, Dorothy turned back to Gerald. My husband died 12 years ago. Heart attack. He was only 54. We had some savings, but not much. And I had our daughter to worry about, Sarah. She just had Michael, and she was struggling. Dorothy's eyes grew distant. I was working 2 jobs, trying to keep our house, trying to help Sarah with the baby. I was exhausted. Angry at God. Angry at the world. Angry at everyone who seemed to have it easier than I did. Gerald listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't listened to anyone in years. One morning, I was at my other job, cleaning offices downtown. I was in this beautiful corner office, and I knocked over a coffee mug on the desk. Not the person's favorite mug, their dead mother's mug. Hand-painted. Irreplaceable. I started crying right there. Expecting to be fired, knowing I couldn't afford to lose that job. Dorothy smiled faintly at the memory. The man whose office it was, he could have destroyed me. Instead, he sat me down and asked what was wrong. Really asked. And I told him everything. About my husband. About my daughter. About feeling like I was drowning. What did he do? Gerald asked, though he somehow already knew this story would change him. He told me his own story. About losing his wife young. About learning that possessions don't matter, but people do. He gave me a month's paid leave to take care of myself and my family. He wrote me a check from his personal account to cover my bills. And he said something I never forgot. He said, "Dorothy, you're not a cleaning lady. You're a woman with a story, with dignity, with worth. Don't let anyone, including yourself, forget that." She looked directly at Gerald. That man saved my life. Not with his money, though that helped, but with his recognition of my humanity. Gerald felt tears burning behind his eyes. And yesterday, I did the opposite. I treated you like you were nothing. You treated me like someone who was having a very bad day, Dorothy corrected gently. Like someone who'd forgotten how to see people. That's different from being a truly cruel person. She adjusted her sling carefully. Mr. Thornton, I've met cruel people. You're not cruel. You're just lost. The words unlocked something in Gerald's chest. My daughter won't speak to me, he said suddenly. Emma, I was terrible to her fiancé. I've been terrible to a lot of people. I built a fortune by stepping on anyone who got in my way, and I told myself it was just business. But it wasn't just business. It was my character. And I hate who I've become. Then become someone different, Dorothy said simply. It's never too late. How? The question came out desperate. How do I fix what I've broken? One apology at a time. One act of kindness at a time. One choice to see someone's humanity instead of their usefulness. Dorothy's grandchildren were coming back down the hall, their voices bright with excitement over juice boxes. Mr. Thornton, I'm going to be out of work for at least 6 weeks. I'm worried sick about bills. About my grandkids. About keeping my apartment. That's my reality right now. Gerald understood what she was saying without her having to spell it out. This was his chance. Not to buy his way out of guilt, but to actually help someone who needed it. What if I covered your expenses while you recover? Your bills, your rent, whatever you need. And what if I made sure the diner could afford to give you fully paid medical leave? He held up his hand before she could protest. Not as charity. As restitution. For being the person I never should have been. Dorothy studied him for a long moment. And after that? After the 6 weeks? What then, Mr. Thornton? Do you go back to your old life and I go back to serving coffee to people who don't see me? No, Gerald said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. No, I'm going to be different. I'm going to call my daughter today and apologize. Really apologize. I'm going to look at my business and figure out how to do it ethically. I'm going to ... He paused. I'm going to try to be the kind of person who deserves to know someone like you. If you've been moved by this story of second chances and human dignity, please subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week, stories that remind us of what truly matters. Michael and Lily burst back into the room, juice boxes in hand. They climbed back onto the bed, careful of their grandmother's injury. Dorothy smiled at them, then at Gerald. All right, Mr. Thornton, I'll accept your help. But on one condition. Anything, Gerald said. Visit us sometimes. Let my grandchildren know that people can change. That grace can transform anyone. Can you do that? Gerald felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been locked away for decades. Yes, he said. I'd be honored. 3 months later, Gerald Thornton sat in a booth at Rosie's Diner. sharing French toast with Michael and Lily while Dorothy refilled his coffee. Her shoulder had healed well. She was back at work, though Gerald had made sure she was working fewer hours with better pay. He'd bought the diner actually quietly, through a trust that ensured the current owner could retire comfortably and the staff would keep their jobs with improved benefits. Dorothy didn't know he owned it. He preferred it that way. Some acts of restitution weren't meant to be celebrated. "Tell us the story again," Lily demanded through a mouthful of whipped cream. "About how you and Grammy met." Gerald smiled. He'd told this story many times now, and each time he felt a little less ashamed and a little more grateful. "Well, I came into this diner being very grumpy and not very nice. And your Grammy taught me an important lesson about kindness." "You were mean to her," Michael said matter-of-factly. "But then you got better." "That's exactly right," Gerald agreed. "I was mean, and she showed me a better way to be." Dorothy set down the coffee pot and slid into the booth across from him. This had become their Saturday morning tradition. Breakfast together. Stories shared. A connection that went deeper than customer and server, deeper even than friendship. It was the connection between two people who'd both been saved by grace and were determined to pass it forward. "Emma called last night," Gerald said, stirring cream into his coffee. "She and Marcus want to come for dinner next week. At my place. She said she's ready to try again." Dorothy's smile lit up her whole face. "Oh, Gerald, that's wonderful." It had taken 2 months of weekly phone calls, of genuine apologies, of showing rather than telling his daughter he'd changed. He'd met with Marcus privately, apologized for his classist behavior, and asked about the young man's life as a teacher. Turned out Marcus was brilliant and compassionate, running an after-school program for at-risk kids. Gerald had anonymously donated to fund the program's expansion. Not for credit, just because it was the right thing to do. "I'm terrified," Gerald admitted. "What if I mess it up again? What if I say the wrong thing?" "Then you'll apologize and try again," Dorothy said simply. "That's what we do, Gerald. We try, we stumble, we get back up." That's being human. Michael was building a tower with sugar packets. Lily was drawing on her paper placemat with crayons Dorothy kept in her apron for the kids who came in. Normal, beautiful, everyday life. The kind of life Gerald had been too busy chasing success to notice. The kind of life that actually mattered. He'd made other changes too. His company was under new management, run by people who actually cared about the communities they developed. He'd established a fund to compensate families his old business practices had displaced. He'd started volunteering at a soup kitchen on Thursdays. Small steps. Imperfect steps. But steps in the right direction. "Do you think people can really change?" he asked Dorothy, watching her grandchildren play. "Fundamentally, I mean. Or are we just who we are?" Dorothy considered the question seriously. "I think people can't change their past," she said. "But they can absolutely change their future." "You're proof of that, Gerald. 3 months ago, you wouldn't have been sitting here asking that question. You wouldn't have cared about the answer. The fact that you're asking means you've already changed." Henry, the old regular from the counter, walked past their booth. He nodded at Gerald. "Morning, Thornton. How's it going?" "Good morning, Henry. It's going well." "How's your back?" "Ah, you know, getting old ain't for sissies." But Henry was smiling. He and Gerald had become something like friends. Gerald had learned that Henry was a veteran, that he'd worked construction for 40 years, that he had a daughter about Emma's age who taught 3rd grade. Gerald had learned to ask people about their lives. It was surprising how much richer his own life became when he took interest in others' as Michael and Lily played. As Dorothy chatted with other regulars, as the morning light streamed through the windows of Rosie's diner, Gerald felt something he hadn't felt in decades, Peace. Not the peace of success or wealth or winning. The peace of knowing you're becoming the person you were meant to be. The peace of second chances and human connection and simple kindness. He thought about that first morning, about the coffee stain, about the rage that had poured out of him. Shame still touched him when he remembered. But Dorothy had been right. He wasn't a cruel person. He'd just been lost. And somehow, through grace he didn't deserve, he'd been found. Not through grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but through quiet moments, through showing up, through choosing kindness even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. "Thank you," he said to Dorothy, and she knew he meant for more than just the coffee. "Thank you for giving Grace a chance," she replied. "That's all any of us can do." If you enjoyed this story about second chances, human dignity, and the power of quiet grace, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these important reminders about what truly matters in life. Thank you for joining us on Gerald and Dorothy's journey. May you find opportunities to both give and receive grace in your own life. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.